He dedicated years to championing justice within the courtroom until he unexpectedly found himself on the opposite side of the law, facing accusations of stealing his own vehicle from a police officer who adamantly refused to acknowledge her error. After a long and arduous day in court, it was finally concluded. Judge Wesley Gains loosened his tie as he settled into the plush leather seat of his Mercedes S-Class, releasing a slow, weary breath. The case he had just overseen, a harrowing corporate fraud trial, had taken a toll on him, but it was the kind of work he was passionate about: justice, balance, and reason were the pillars of his existence. The streets of Birmingham, Alabama, were almost desolate, illuminated by the amber glow of the streetlights that cast elongated shadows across the pavement. He tapped his fingers rhythmically on the steering wheel, waiting for the red light to change. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the flashing red and blue lights of a police vehicle filled his rear-view mirror. A frown creased his brow. He was not speeding, nor had he missed a stop sign. What could this possibly be about? His grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly as he pulled over the side of the road, fully aware of the routine. Keep your hands visible, remain calm, and comply. A sharp knock on the driver's side window interrupted his thoughts. Wesley turned to face the icy glare of a uniformed officer. A white woman in her mid-40s with blonde hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her face. Her badge read Doyle. "License and registration," she demanded, her voice clipped and devoid of any greeting or explanation. Wesley nodded and reached into the glove compartment, moving deliberately slow to eliminate any potential for misinterpretation. He handed over his documents, but instead of examining them, Officer Catherine Doyle barely glanced at the papers. Her gaze was fixed on him, scrutinizing his face, his suit, and his watch. "Is this your car?" she inquired. Wesley exhaled through his nose. "Yes. Is there a problem, officer?" She took a step back, tilting her head. "Mind telling me where you got it?" His fingers flexed against the steering wheel. He had heard this line too many times before. "It's mine," he replied, keeping his voice even. "It's registered in my name." She lifted her radio and spoke into it. "I've got a possible stolen vehicle here, requesting backup." Wesley stared at her, the words falling from her lips so casually, so matter-of-factly, as if she hadn't just accused him of grand theft auto without a shred of evidence. "Officer Doyle," he said carefully, "if you look at the registration, you'll confirm that when backup gets here." She cut him off, commanding, "Step out of the vehicle." He hesitated, refusing to move just yet. He wasn't going to become another sensational news story, another statistic, or another man forced to prove his right to exist. But before he could utter another word, a second set of headlights swung into view, illuminating the scene. Backup had arrived. What transpired next would challenge Wesley's patience in ways he could never have anticipated. The squad car came to a stop a few feet behind Wesley's Mercedes, its lights casting a cold glow on the pavement. Officer Doyle stood tall, her shoulders squared, as a second officer stepped out. Officer Patrick Harris, in his mid-30s with a buzz cut, wore an eager expression, as if he were ready for action. Doyle turned to him, her voice brisk. "Possible stolen vehicle situation." Harris glanced at Wesley, not at the car, not at the registration Doyle still clutched, but at him, a black man in an expensive suit behind the wheel of a car that seemed too luxurious for him. That was all the justification they needed. Wesley had spent decades in courtrooms dissecting improper police stops, exposing racial bias, and delivering judgments that held officers accountable. Now he was experiencing it firsthand, but he wasn't naive, reaching for the door handle. He moved deliberately slow, ensuring his other hand remained clearly visible on the wheel. The moment he stepped out, Doyle seized his wrist. "Turn around." A dry laugh almost escaped him. "Turn around? I'm not under arrest. No crime has been committed." He squared his shoulders. "Officer, I am Judge Wesley Gains. I am not resisting. I am asking on what grounds you're detaining me." Doyle's jaw clenched. She hadn't anticipated any pushback. "Because I said so," she snapped. Wesley locked eyes with her, having spent his entire life mastering control in the courtroom where emotions had no place. He dealt in facts, reason, and logic, but at that moment, logic wouldn't save him. Harris stepped closer, his fingers twitching near his belt. Judge or not, you don't get special treatment, he muttered. Wesley's breath slowed. He wasn't asking for special treatment. He was merely requesting basic human decency. Doyle's radio crackled with a status update. She hesitated, for what could she say? She had nothing. No probable cause, no stolen vehicle. Only her own assumptions. Yet, instead of admitting her error, she doubled down. Put your hands behind your back. Wesley's pulse thundered in his ears. The situation was spiraling out of control. Just when he thought it couldn't get any worse, another car pulled up. This time, it wasn't just another officer. Sergeant Luis Ramirez had arrived. Would he improve the situation or exacerbate it? Sergeant Luis Ramirez stepped out his cruiser with purpose, mid-50s, stocky build, salt and pepper hair. A man who had seen it all. Unlike Doyle and Harris, he didn't rush. He surveyed the scene, his sharp eyes darting between Wesley's calm yet tense demeanor, Doyle's rigid posture, and Harris's fidgeting fingers near his belt. "What's going on here?" Ramirez asked, his voice steady but heavy, the kind of tone that demanded answers. Doyle straightened, keeping her hand near her holster. "Possible stolen vehicle," she quickly explained. "The driver refuses to comply." Ramirez didn't move immediately. His brow furrowed. "Driver?" he repeated. Then, almost as an afterthought, he finally glanced at the ID Doyle was still holding. That's when his entire demeanor shifted. He blinked, his jaw tightening as he looked at Wesley, and then back at Doyle. "This man is Judge Wesley Gains." His voice wasn't loud, but the weight behind it made Doyle flinch. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Harris's face. But Doyle remained unyielding, her grip on control slipping. "That doesn't change the fact that—" Ramirez interrupted her with a look, a slow, deliberate shake of his head. "No." Then turning fully to Wesley, his tone softened. "Judge Gains, are you all right?" Wesley understood where this was headed. It was never truly about the car. "Sir." "Step out," Doyle repeated, this time with her hand hovering near her holster. Wesley took a slow breath. "Officer," I complied. "You have my ID and my registration. If you check your system, you'll see the vehicle is legally mine." Doyle's lips pressed into a thin line. She showed no interest in verifying anything. She had already made her mind up about who he was. "Step out of the vehicle." Wesley exhaled slowly, his patience wearing thin. "Sergeant, I complied with every order. I provided my license and registration. Your officer refused to verify it and instead called for backup, escalating a situation that should never have occurred." Ramirez's nostrils flared as he turned back to Doyle, his voice clipped. "Did you run his plates?" Doyle hesitated, and that hesitation confirmed everything Ramirez needed to know. He snatched the registration from her hand and pulled out his radio. "Dispatch, run a plate check on a black Mercedes. License number." He rattled it off, and the response was immediate. No reports of theft. The vehicle was registered to a Wesley Gains. A lengthy, painful silence ensued. Ramirez turned fully to Doyle. "You had this information in your hands and still escalated? Do you even hear yourself?" His voice was low, but sliced through the night like a knife. Doyle's lips pressed into a thin line. "I was just being cautious," she muttered. "No, you weren't." Ramirez shot back. "You were being reckless." But Doyle wasn't ready to concede. She had come too far to admit she was wrong. "That doesn't mean the judge wasn't acting suspicious," she muttered. Wesley stared at her, incredulous. "Suspicious for what?" He released a slow breath, his fingers curling into fists. Ramirez turned back to him, his expression heavy with something akin to regret. "I apologize for this, Judge Gains," he said, his voice low. "This never should have happened." But the damage had already been inflicted, and Doyle still refused to acknowledge her mistake. The question loomed. Would she actually face repercussions, or would the system once again shield its own? Wesley stood there, his jaw clenched, his heart steady yet burdened. He had spent years upholding the law, believing in the integrity of the system. Yet here he was, on the other side of it, humiliated, judged, and accused. Sergeant Ramirez had made his position clear. Doyle wasn't wrong, but she wouldn't relinquish control. "I was just doing my job," Doyle insisted, arms crossed, her voice losing its edge but her pride unwilling to let her back down completely. How was I supposed to know who he was? Ramirez stared at her. You weren't supposed to know who he was. You were supposed to do your job correctly. But Doyle still refused to look at Wesley, never having done so from the beginning. Wesley inhaled deeply, summoning every ounce of patience remaining. Officer Doyle, I'd like to hear it directly from you, he said, his voice measured. Do you believe you had legitimate cause to pull me over? Not just suspicion, but legitimate cause? Doyle's throat worked as if she wanted to respond, but no words emerged because there was nothing to say. The sole reason she had stopped him was her perception that a black man in an expensive car didn't belong there. And now, with Ramirez standing by, the weight of the truth pressed heavily upon her. She knew it too, yet she still wouldn't articulate the words. Ramirez exhaled sharply, shaking his head before turning back to Wesley. Judge Gains, you're free to go. A bitter laugh nearly escaped him. Free to go, he echoed, as if he had been detained for a legitimate reason. Wesley reached for his car door, but something within him halted. He had spent decades in courtrooms issuing rulings on police misconduct, racial profiling, and abuse of power. Yet when it happened to him, what was stopping him from simply walking away and letting it slide? Nothing, except for the next man Doyle might pull over, and the next, and the next. He turned back around. No. Ramirez blinked. No, I'm not letting this go, Wesley declared. I will be filing a formal complaint. Officer Doyle abused her authority tonight, and I want that on record. Doyle's head snapped toward him, her cheeks flushing with anger. You can't be serious. Wesley tilted his head. I am a judge. When I say something, I mean it. Ramirez nodded slowly but firmly. That's your right, he said, then looked at Doyle. And you will have to answer for it. For the first time, Doyle appeared nervous. She had been shielded before. But would she be protected now? That was the real question, and Wesley wasn't leaving without an answer. Doyle's expression hardened, but something flickered behind her eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps even fear. She had always escaped situations like this unscathed, relying on a simple excuse, a quick dismissal, or at worst, a slap on the wrist. But not this time. Sergeant Ramirez pulled out his notepad, his jaw tight. Officer Doyle, I need you to state on record why you pulled over Judge Gains. Doyle squared her shoulders. I told you, suspicious activity. Ramirez's eyes narrowed. And what was suspicious? She hesitated for just a moment, but in that fleeting second, Wesley saw it all. The calculation, the scramble for justification, the quiet panic. There was no probable cause, Ramirez stated flatly. None. Doyle's hands balled into fists. This is ridiculous, she muttered. Are we really going to let people like him intimidate us? Silence enveloped them as Wesley let her words sink in. People like him? Ramirez took a slow step closer, his voice low, steady, but dangerous. Say that again. Doyle clamped her mouth shut, and Wesley released a slow breath. There it was, not even a hint of regret, not the smallest acknowledgement that she had been wrong. She wasn't sorry. She was merely upset that she got caught. Ramirez exhaled sharply and turned back to Wesley. I'll ensure this is documented, sir. Wesley nodded slowly. Good, but it's not enough. I also want to speak with your captain tonight. Doyle's had snapped up, real panic evident now. Ramirez didn't argue. He reached for his radio. Dispatch! Patch me through to Captain Emerson. We have an urgent situation. A beat of silence followed. Copy that, connecting you now. Doyle's chest rose and fell rapidly, her breath quickening, her composure finally unraveling. You're really doing this? She snapped at Wesley, but his expression remained calm and steady. Yes, because if I don't, who will? This time, the system had to answer for itself. But the real test wasn't just what transpired that night. It was what would follow. The ride home felt different. The roads were the same. The city lights still flickered against the windshield. But Wesley was no longer the same man who had left the courthouse hours earlier. He had always believed in justice, in the law, in the notion that if you adhered to the rules, the system would function properly. But tonight, that belief had been shattered. He pulled into his driveway and sat there for a long moment, the weight of everything settling heavily on his shoulders. Would Doyle face real consequences, or would she simply be shuffled to another precinct, given sensitivity training, and allowed to continue her unchecked power trips? He had witnessed it all too many times before, but this time it was his name on the complaint, his status demanding accountability. That was the part that sat like a stone in his gut. What if he hadn't been a judge? What if he had been an ordinary black man returning home from work? Someone without a title to protect him? Would he have been arrested, thrown to the ground, or worse? The thought made his fingers tighten around the steering wheel. This wasn't just about him. It was about every other black man who wouldn't have a Sergeant Ramirez to intervene, who wouldn't have the privilege of walking away with their dignity intact. His mind drifted back to Doyle, her arrogance, her defiance, the way she refused to admit she was wrong. That wasn't merely one cop. That was a culture, a system that only changed when pressure was applied. And that was precisely what he intended to do tomorrow. He wouldn't just file a complaint. He would advocate for change. He would demand transparency, accountability, and consequences. Because if even a judge could be treated this way, what did that signify for everyone else? He exhaled, shaking his head. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. And this time, he wasn't just donning the robe of a judge. He was standing as a man demanding justice. If you believe in accountability, if you believe the story is significant, make your voice heard. Share this. Speak up. Change occurs when we refuse to remain silent.